So it's
I
really,
think we started.
I have to tell you, it's, you know, I think it's COVID. That's one of the things with COVID. We look a little different than we looked before. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's interesting. But Anita, you look great.
Smoking
We're
means-
live now and we're
Okay.
streaming to YouTube, okay?
Okay,
Okay. You have attendees coming into the room now.
okay. Oh, okay, well, we're up to 60 already. Will we see the number on the bottom, Sarah?
If you have your participants tab open, you will see it beside panelists.
I don't know how to do that, and I'm afraid to touch anything.
What's here?
Well, good evening, everyone. I can't see you. I can't see your beautiful faces, but I can see the tab, the number of you who have logged on so far on my computer. There are 60 souls that have joined us at this late hour. We're going to get started at 7:05. So in the meantime, I have no music to pipe in. So just sit tight and we'll be with you shortly. We're excited that you joined us and we're looking forward to this discussion. I thought of everything. I should have had some mood music. Okay, there we go. So we're up to 72 participants. We're going to start in 3 more minutes, folks. And while we're waiting for the others, because we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with just some very basic information. Let me just welcome those of you who have registered and who are here with us today. I'm Anita Wallace-Thomas. I'm a partner at the law office of Nelson Mullins, Riley and Scarborough. And when my good friend, State Bar President Don Jones, reached out to me and asked me if I would chair this committee that she was forming, she had me at Anti-Racist Committee. I was delighted. I will tell you, I've been so inspired by these young folks who've been out on the front lines protesting issues surrounding race and justice. And I'm very aware that I am not what I used to be, so I can't be out there in these COVID streets, but I think we all can play a part in this very big issue that's facing our country. And our state bar is not immune from some of the effects of unconscious biases, racism, and inequities. So Don Jones, this is the birth child of our State Bar President, my dear friend, Don Jones. We are here today on behalf of the Seeking Equal Justice and Addressing Racism and Racial Bias Committee. And I can tell you that the title is long, but Don was very intentional about every word, every part of that title of our committee. So our goal is to create and encourage dialogue on the sensitive topics surrounding race, and ultimately create a better understanding of the differing perspectives surrounding this issue. So we're at about 7:05 now. Let's see here. So we're at 7:05. I promised you that we were going to get at it early. So we have with us today, let me just say, this is the first in a series of these courageous conversations that we are planning throughout the year. We believe that when you know better, you do better. And even though sometimes a conversation about race and justice can be uncomfortable, They are absolutely necessary, especially in this climate. So we are delighted to have as our our launch these wonderful panelists. First, let me introduce you to my dear friend and my sister, C.K. Hoffler. For many, she does not require an introduction. C.K. specializes in complex commercial litigation, catastrophic injury, opioid litigation, tobacco litigation, First Amendment rights, and employment litigation. And if you have a case and you need just a kick butt plaintiff's lawyer, CK is your girl. She gets it done in the courtroom. She gets it done in life. She's also the president of the National Bar Association. So she's here today not only as a litigator who has, and a member of the Georgia Bar who has a vested interest in this legal community, but in her role as the National Bar Association president. We also have with us three members of the staff of the Fulton County Daily Report. And we were talking before we got on that how much we, the members of our committee, appreciate their participation. We understand that it's not always comfortable to have this conversation, particularly when you are met with folks that are none too pleased with things that have gone on in your shop, but they're here and they're willing to engage, and we appreciate that. So we have with us Jonathan Ringel, who is the managing editor of the Fulton County Daily Report, Zach Needles, who's the editor-in-chief of Law.com, Hank Greslak, who is the editor-chief of Legal Things, Regional Brands, and Law.com. So let me do a little table setting. I can tell you that this is all about conversations, and I hope that my role will be very limited. I am here to steer this conversation to the extent that it needs that, but I am very confident that the folks on your screen do not need that much intervention. And just so you all know, we have 87 participants on this, what is today, Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock, and I'm so pleased with that. How do we get here? Many of you know, but to the extent you don't, let me do some little table setting. And Sarah, if you could pull up the PowerPoint. We went from how a disbarred lawyer came to deliver a hero's final plea. That was the first headline. And we went from that to a new title, How Bill Campbell Came to Deliver a Dying Hero's Final Plea. And I can tell you that we probably would not have gone from that first title of that article to the second without the leadership of CK, Kimberly Burrows, who's the president of Gabois, Karen Cloud, the president of Gate City, David Ware, and Michael Coleman, who all took the time to go from just being frustrated privately at their desks to actually writing letters and being proactive and expressing their concern. So let's talk about what was written. Sarah, if you can advance to the next slide. So first, there was a letter from David Ware, and I'm not going to read the entire letter, just some excerpts from his letter. He wrote, "I am sure I am not the only person puzzled by your choice of headline, how a disabled lawyer came to deliver a hero's final plea in your coverage of Congressman Lewis's funeral. Perhaps you can explain why former Mayor Bill Campbell's bar status was relevant to the story. If you were aiming for coverage of lawyers who spoke at the service, you missed the fact that another disbarred lawyer, President Bill Clinton, also paid homage to Mr. Lewis." And then there came a letter from my girl CK. CK wrote in part, "I and other readers are still struck by the venom spewed in the article about former Mayor Bill Campbell. Justice for one is justice for all. I must condemn biased and unfair reporting as it devalues the essence of Black Lives Matter and is reminiscent of what Congressman John Lewis and our civil rights heroes fought so valiantly to obliterate. Next, we heard from Kimberly Burrows Dubrow, who is the president of the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys, and she wrote in part, unfortunately, injected a reference to Bill Campbell's status of being a disbarred attorney, which was completely unrelated to Congressman Lewis's final plea. The reference served no journalistic purpose, and therefore we could only surmise that it was intended to sow discord and disparage Bill Campbell in a moment when he, the city of Atlanta, and the United States stopped to mourn the loss of Congressman Lewis and herald the contributions he made to our nation. Well, we weren't finished. We next heard from Michael Coleman. Michael Coleman wrote, the headline, How a Disbarred Lawyer Came to Deliver a Dying Hero's Final Plea, was wrong on so many levels and so egregious that it is emblematic of the issues that African Americans face in today's society and totally tone deaf in this era of increased focus on equality. Rather than inflicting pain on the family of Congressman Lewis, the family of Mayor Campbell, and the African American community, the Daily Report should take its knee off of our necks. You can advance. And then after that flurry of letters, who I believe pretty accurately captured the sentiments of many other members of the African American legal community, myself included, we then heard from the editor-in-chief, who said, first of all, he acknowledged with the headline, a totally different headline, we blew it with article on Campbell eulogy. It then went on to say, we received several passionate letters expressing how wrong and tone deaf many found the headline and mention of Campbell's past legal troubles. We heard you, we get it, we're sorry, we need to do better. We owe that to all our readers. So we're here today to have a conversation about how we went from that initial article about the disbarred lawyer to we blew it. What can we do better to fix this? So CK, I'm going to start with you. If you could unmute your mic, and I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about your response to that letter and why it is that you felt it important to not just stop there. And then Jonathan or whoever wants to respond, I want to hear, I think the audience wants to hear from you about your reaction to those letters and when you knew that we might have stepped in it. So CK, why don't you get us started?
First of all, thank you, Anita, so much for convening these courageous discussions. And I want to thank our president of the Georgia Bar, Dawn Lewis, for her foresight and her passion, because indeed we need to have these courageous discussions about issues that make us feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I can tell you, it made me plenty uncomfortable and frankly, very upset when I read the article. So let me just back up a little bit so that I can explain, and I think we've talked about this, why I was so upset in my visceral reaction. So I am the president of the National Bar Association, which is a social justice organization representing the interests of over 66,000 African-American lawyers. So part of me is, my response was as the president of the National Bar Association, because immediately I started to receive emails and text messages locally in the Atlanta metropolitan area, as well as nationally, from people who had seen the article, who were horrified, my members who were horrified. But that's not really the full picture for me, because I'm also chair of the board of the Rainbow Push Coalition. I've been Reverend Jesse Jackson's personal lawyer, his family's lawyer, the organization's lawyer for 32 of my 33 years in practice. So my whole civil rights perspective comes from the work that I've done with Reverend Jesse Jackson. I've known Congressman John Lewis for many, many years, the late Congressman John Lewis. In fact, on March 2nd of 2020, I sat in his office with Reverend Jesse Jackson, and we charted out my civil rights agenda and the voting rights agenda for being president of the National Bar. And he gave me a clarion call, but it wasn't just that. As an African-American woman, take away all of the titles, take away the fact that I'm a trial lawyer and I've litigated successfully against the press, against the media in the past, in Florida and here. Here we settled, in Florida we litigated to verdict. So take away all of that, strip away all of my litigation experience, all that I've done as a trial lawyer and all of the civil rights work I've done, all of the social justice work I've done. That article, the title alone, How a Disbarred Lawyer Came to Deliver a Dying Hero's Final Plea, was so horrifically offensive, it impacted every fiber of my body and my being. Every fiber. It was not just, well, you know, kind of hurt. This was so fundamentally offensive to me as an African-American person and as a woman. Because you see, we do take, Congressman John Lewis was an American hero, an international hero, but he was also, in my mind, my hero, our hero. He was in the Atlanta community. I known him. I had fought issues. I used to be a lobbyist years and years ago, over 30 years ago when I started to practice in DC. So I know a lot about the process, and Congressman John Lewis was someone who we all hold near and dear. And so I thought the coverage, the appropriate coverage of the Daily Report of this extraordinary hero's death and leaving us, this person who gave all of us a clarion call to fight for justice, to fight against inequality, to fight against discrimination, to fight against bias, to fight against racism. I thought that the coverage of this hero would be about this hero, this man who gave so much here in our backyard in Atlanta. And that's what I expected. That's what I expected. If you just take away that I'm a lawyer, that's what I expected. And I got calls from people who were not even lawyers. So when I saw the article about just the caption of it drew me directly to something that I thought was completely inappropriate, unnecessary, and uncalled for in an article about our hero, our John Lewis. The focus was immediately shifted to former Mayor Bill Campbell's bar status. Well, what in the world did his bar status have to do with anything? Nothing. It had nothing to do with anything. Nothing. And so again, the visceral reaction that I had was because as a Black person, oftentimes I've been the victim of a reaction that has really nothing to do with anything that's relevant other than the color of my skin or perhaps my gender. And that's what I read, that's what I felt. So it ignited in me on all fronts. I was ready to go into court, to be very candid with you, because that's who I speak truth to power, in my humble impression.
Well, let me ask you this, CK, and then I want to hear from the gentleman. Several of the letters also echoed your sentiment that the title of the article was totally unrelated with the late Congressman Lewis's legacy. But I believe it was Mr. Coleman's letter that he said that it was emblematic of the treatment of African-American people in so many issues in the media and other areas. Was that something that also spoke to you as well?
It did to me. It spoke to me because it's sort of an implicit bias. A lot of times there's coverage of issues concerning the Black community where there is an insensitivity or lack of sensitivity as to what could be important to us. I felt that I couldn't imagine a group of very, very talented journalists would look at this article and not have a reaction that it would be offensive to African Americans. Okay. And so that is the systemic issue that we see in the reporting on issues involving African Americans, injecting things that are really have no place in being injected. And it leaves you with an impression of people don't care about things that are important to you. But it was because there was reporting on our hero, and this is the way that the decisions were made to report that probably really was most offensive to me. But certainly it's that bias, it's that implicit bias that we see, quite frankly, in a lot of journalism. This is not the first time. It really isn't that I've seen this. As I said, I've litigated a lot of issues and the First Amendment area as well. So I think that it is important when we dissect this, and I have to applaud, I must applaud the Daily Report for its response. So we got to be fair. We got to present all sides of this.
Absolutely.
Because my reaction was about is everybody that spoke to me about this, and there were many people that called me, that reached out to me. There were a group of us that spoke, my sisters from Gabois, Gate City, and others. And there were some judges also that were very, very offended by this. But of course, the canons of judicial ethics, they're not going to be able and would not speak publicly about this. Many people cannot speak publicly about this, but many people in our community were disturbed, from people who are lawyers to people who are non-lawyers, just because of the systemic issues, what it meant. It just kind of struck a chord.
Sure.
So again, I go back to the Daily Report because I've been in battles where the media has not corrected it. So,
right. So let me just jump in here because I want the gentleman that's a lot. Clearly folks were hot as fish grease over the headline and the treatment. And I believe the new version with the new title, I believe that came from Mr. Grieslak. Is that right?
Grieslak, yep.
And as I recall, it said, "We hear you, we understand you, we see you." I'm not sure, but it seemed that it reeked of ownership. So I want to know, we want to hear from you. How did you react once you started receiving those letters? What was the reaction? Take us into those conversations in your offices, and how you reacted and how you even got to the point where that was the headline. So that's a compound question, which would not be any good in court. But for our purposes here, I think you guys can handle that. And I think this audience can figure that out. So go ahead.
Sure. If I could for a second, just take a step back. So where I think this stemmed from in terms of the mistake was, just to give a little bit of context, and keep in mind what I'm about to explain is how we stepped in it, right? How we made the mistake. It's not to excuse it. It's not to try to rationalize it. I just try to explain how it happened. So in our newsroom, we're like a lot of media companies, limited resources. One of the things we preach to the reporters in general is, number one, like, if you're going to cover something that the general press is at, you got to make it unique. Find the unique angle for the audience. But the other thing is, we're always looking, regardless of whether it originates in a region, trying to find something that will travel. In other words, frame it in such a way that even if you're not from there, you'll get it. And I think inadvertently, and we can talk more about this, CK raises some good points about being attuned to sensitivities and how things can be perceived. And that was sort of the miss here. And I think what Kathy was just trying to do is like, okay, everyone's covering this. People outside Atlanta don't know who Bill Campbell is. What's the hook? But it's like looking at it with like this and not looking at the full perspective, or asking, how could this be perceived? Could this be viewed in a different way? And when we got the letters, I mean, look, media organizations, we get letters all the time, and we get impassioned letters all the time. There wasn't much of a debate within our organization. And let me also be clear, it's not, the passion resonated with us, but that it wasn't like, oh, everyone's mad, we better placate them. It was, we got it. Like the letters, the thoughts, it was like, as soon as we read them, we're like, oh crap, how did we miss that? How did we not get that? How we not, like, it was staring us right in the face and we missed it. And that was a wake-up call. One of the letters you pointed out, one of the first things I saw was the one point about like, hey, Clinton was in the audience. You didn't mention, and it's like, oh my God. Because I've been in conversations in my other jurisdictions where I am, and we've had these conversations about stuff, and I get it. Like, it's evidence of a double standard, and you can't do that. So we didn't have to, it wasn't much of a debate internally. And I have to tell you, like, I've been in journalism 28 years. I've been at ALM for 27 years. I've never done this, but it was an easy, in my standpoint, and I'll let Zach and Jonathan speak to it. It was an easy decision. It was an easy decision.
That's one of the questions I wondered, was that unique? I was struck by the swift response and the swift reversal, but what was unique? What is it? You said you've been in the business, I think you said 20 years?
28 years.
28 years. So what is it about this situation that caused you to do that?
Because it was all right. So a couple things. One, to speak to CK's thing, we revere John Lewis too. And the idea, which had never even occurred to us, that this would be seen as anything besmirching him, horrified us. I mean, flat out horrified us. I mean, we were all upset about it. Like, we felt really bad about it. It's a gut level check on that. But again, like, we're in the business of we're supposed to be objective and fair. And to me, take even John Lewis out of it, the fact that is simply pointed out, we should be treating everyone equally. And the fact that his disbarment is mentioned, but none is mentioned about Bill Clinton is just stark. It's real simple. And I'd like to think that as an organization, when you screw up, fess up, own it, don't run from it, and try to correct it.
So CK, why don't you, what's your response to that? He mentioned that, how did we miss this? Isn't that part of the deeper problem?
Yes.
Right? Why don't you speak a little to that?
Well, yes, absolutely. So I do, like I said, I give credit to the Daily Report for saying they missed it. They got it wrong. They get it now. But that's only the first step in a process, in my impression, because it's the fact that, 20 journalists saw this and no one got it. And so that speaks more to me than just one article that they missed. It speaks to more what's going on in the environment where on something that is, this smacked me in the face. It smacked me in the face. And in fact, it smacked in the face so many people in different walks of life. And so for me, it was, this is just one level, the admission of we missed it. And that's really important because there can never be constructive change unless there's an admission, we did mess up. So that's why I do applaud the Daily Report for doing that. But then there's the next step. And that's why we felt the need to have a meeting. One of the things that I wanted to do, and I mentioned in my letter, was let's meet with the editorial board, because I've been, in this space for a long time. And I felt that with the Daily Report and its parent company and all of the reach that it has in this digital world, that I felt they really could do better. Knowing that there are some great journalists there, they could do better. They missed the boat, and that was more because of something systemic. That's what I felt. And I felt that we needed to have a meeting about it because, it's one thing to say, well, to criticize or to be upset about something, but let's talk about the solution. And I was interested in the solution. The group of people that came together that included Kimberly Burroughs DeBro from Gabra, just the president of Gabra, the president of Gate City, Karen Clouds, and Tom Sampson, who was the dean. When we talk about in this community, that extraordinary trial lawyer who has paved the way for many of us, we came together and we met. And it was really, I think, a good meeting because, again, the first step is an admission that there's something wrong. But the second step is, okay, let's talk about it. So that was good because for us, it was enough to just have an admission. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're fine. You're fine. It's a little hard to do this with Zoom, but I wanted to ask you, for you and the gentleman as well, some might say that the question, how did we miss this, goes directly to the issue of unconscious bias, because I think that many people, especially as advanced as we are, in Atlanta especially, I like to think that, we're pretty exposed and evolved, and people aren't just, doing blatant things these days. No one's getting called, to N-word, not to their faces, but it usually, when we see bias, it's usually a more subtle form. And it's done without people really knowing. I'd like to think that most people do not start off with bad intentions when they're biased. So my question is that what this was? A gentleman, CK, what do you think?
My view is it was unconscious bias. I think it was, perhaps there was not the intent. There never is the intent when there's bias. That's why it's unconscious bias. It's not where someone is intending to inflict the kind of pain. It's not that way. It's unconscious. It's because we're a product of our experiences. And if we're in an environment where those types of issues are not discussed or put in check, then what we see is something like this. because a lot of people saw this before it went out and it was completely missed. So in my world of having litigated discrimination cases and looked at these issues in social justice, it's part of unconscious bias. That doesn't mean that we have a bunch of bad people here. No, it just means that there was an unconscious bias, and that led to this article coming out without that was surely fact checked, and that was surely reviewed by, because I know how these articles get to press. And even when you're up against a timeline, there are protocols, but none of the protocols caught that this would be highly offensive. And that's unconscious, that's subliminal. That's something that sometimes you can't put your finger on it. It's not the N word. It's something sometimes more dangerous than the N word, because it's unconscious, it's subliminal. And the power of the press has such an ability to shape people's minds, to shape the message, to brand things good and bad, that it had such a significant impact nationwide. And there were some people internationally who called me about it too, because I have an international reach. So unconscious bias for me is an issue that it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but we need to talk about it. And again, I'm happy that we're at this place and at this table here tonight talking about it, because that's the first step to finding solutions.
Gentlemen?
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I'm not going to argue against it, right? So it's like, I think an important part of all of this and all the conversations that have been going on for the last several months is for folks like us to listen and to learn. And to me, it was a wake-up call. I mean, that's kind of how I view it. And we've had these conversations internally before and have tried to be very cognizant of certain things, but this really kind of really drove it home, if you will, really drove it home about, about really taking a pause. Let's put it this way. I think one of the problems with modern journalism is you're constantly in a rush and you get sort of tunnel vision on stuff. And to me, this was a reminder about being mindful and taking just a second on pause and asking yourself about different perspectives. And that doesn't always happen. Zach, Jonathan, I don't know if you guys have other perspectives.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I was the frontline editor on Kathy's story. So when I saw that headline, I'm embarrassed to admit it now, but it didn't strike me as an issue. The story, in fact, was meant to be a complimentary. It was meant to be a story about Bill Campbell delivering a very moving tribute to his friend, John Lewis. And I'll be honest, I did not know who Bill Campbell was. And when we talked about it, the thought behind the headline was Bill Campbell was somebody who hadn't been in the public eye for a few years. He reemerged in a big way at John Lewis's service. It wasn't the first story that we did on John Lewis's service, so we were looking for a different angle. And the idea was, here's Bill Campbell, and he had this disbarment, he had this criminal case in his past. He'd been out of the public eye for a little bit. He was back, and he was giving a very, like I said, a very moving tribute. When we got the letters, I was surprised by the backlash at first, until, like Hank said, I took a second to really think about it. The fact that we didn't say that Bill Clinton was disbarred, definitely glaring in hindsight. And I was absolutely horrified, because I do think of myself as somebody who's sensitive to these issues. I was absolutely horrified at the idea that anybody would take this as somehow trying to denigrate John Lewis, because he's a hero to me as well. And that was when it really hit home for me. If that's how people perceive this, then absolutely we were wrong. And look, like you said, it's called unconscious bias for a reason. I mentioned how surprised I was, because I think it's important to highlight why we need to have these conversations, to be educated on these issues, and to understand where we went wrong and why we went wrong. So I definitely learned a lot from this process.
Perfect. So
I think one thing.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add that, as Hank alluded to, there was very little debate about what to do. We've had many long debates about somebody writing us a letter and complaining, and there's always usually there's a lot to discuss. This was the only question was sort of like, how quickly can we get this apology letter out? That was sort of remarkable. One thing that I learned was something that Hank pointed out, which was that, forgive the, Hank can correct me if I'm wrong, but he had a conversation with a Black lawyer some years ago who had said that his perception was that, you know, Black lawyers only end up on the front page of the paper when they've done something wrong. And that was a very, that point, that was just something I had not thought about. I sort of view the lawyers that come on our front page, some of them have won cases, some of them have lost cases, some of them are in trouble. I had not considered that aspect of the issue, and I thought that that was something that I learned immediately in this, and it's a good thing to know.
CK, you were going to talk about the meeting, so why don't you talk about?
Can I add one more thing?
Yes,
I'd like to add one more thing. Amid all the letters that we've gotten over the years from people complaining about, you know, saying that they don't like the article or something like that, I honestly think this is the first one that has ever said, "Can we meet?" Which I thought was sort of remarkable. I was so happy you suggested that, because I thought this needs to go beyond, you know, a little correction or something like that. So that was sort of a remarkable part of this experience.
Well, you must have read my mind, because that's where I wanted CK to go. Because you're right, you know, it could have just stopped with that letter, or it could have, frankly, for many of us, it just stopped with, "Can you believe this article?" But CK, you took it a step further. So why don't you talk about why that was important? Tell us about everything that went into your thinking about what next, how can we make this thoughtful, why you even took time out of your very busy schedule to spearhead this effort and to go over and have that conversation. And then you guys just take us into the room about and tell us more about what happened during that conversation. So CK, take it away.
Well, you know, I wanted to meet with I called it the editorial board, because I had, ironically, years ago, I tried a false light case, a team of us when I was a partner in Willie Gary's office in Florida, in Pensacola. And ironically, one of my co-counsel on that case was Bill Campbell. This is a long time ago. It was a false light case, but that was just the irony of this. And in that case, as a result of that, because, you know, we, you know, made history and broke a record in terms of the verdict in Florida. It was the only case tried to verdict for false light in Florida. And since that cause of action has been eliminated, after that, I became, if you will, an expert in First Amendment issues, defamation and false light. And I began speaking to, at the request of the defense bar and others, not giving away my secrets, but speaking to them as to how to avoid litigation. What are the kinds of things that you can do as publishers, as owners of newspapers, as media entities, whether it's television or print? What should we be doing to avoid litigation? And I knew that the discussion happened at the editorial level. You can't just say, "Oh, that's, you know, that's sad, I feel bad," and send a letter. It doesn't stop there if you really want there to be a change. And so that's why I suggested that. And I felt that we did have a meeting. What was great was that you all were very receptive. You know, Hank, Jonathan, and Zach, you all were there. You were very receptive. We exchanged communication. We had an agenda for the meeting of things we wanted to discuss. Everybody came at it from a different perspective. We had me with the national/international perspective, and having done this kind of litigation. You had Gabla that was there represented by Kim. You had Gate City there represented by Karen, and you had Tom Sampson representing really all of us, I would say, because he is really the dean and someone who, as I said before, we look up to. And I think we had a good discussion, but we were interested in action items. So from the discussion, again, we wanted to follow up. We had a spirited discussion about why we felt the way we did, much of the same things we said here today, from different perspectives, because the hurt was deep. The hurt was deep from everyone. And then we did talk about unconscious bias. We talked about bias and how that manifests itself. And that was a discussion I thought that was very eye-opening for probably both sides. But we wanted to also say, how can we be part of the solution? Because talk is so cheap. I go back to Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm not saying that just as relates to the Daily Report, but again, in so many instances in social justice, we're operating in an environment where we're seeing Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and on and on and on and on and on. So we're not just on a regular platform, we're standing on a bed of injustice and a desperate need for social change. So that informs why the need to go further. But we want it to be constructive. Let us, with our perspective also, and with this exchange, help to be a part of the solution, meaning we think we have some helpful hints. There might be a lack of diversity perhaps in the newsroom or in the global company, because unconscious bias has to do with training, with spotting issues, with your orientation. And if it's, everybody has the same orientation and, you're under deadlines, a lot of the issues get missed, just as Zach said, because, it just is. But the important thing is to talk about it and then let's put in a plan for action. So we talked about some of the things that we would like to see. I've been a part in the past of having groups go to companies, organizations, and do training. And it's not just sufficient to do one training session. And the training can be training on bias, sensitivity training, it's called. There are many, many names, where all of the journalists would do that in this case, not just a segment, but all of the journalists, the editors, because this is potentially systemic, because it wasn't just one person. A number of people saw this. And so we felt that we needed to capture and come up with solutions that would cover that would incorporate that. And so we had a discussion about that, and we had followed communication. For instance, where do you find extraordinarily brilliant, talented Black journalists? Well, the starting point is NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists. I even reached out because I've represented two past presidents of NABJ. So I reached out to them. I said, hey, help me out with this. I didn't give them a lot of the details. I just said, where would you begin in terms of sensitizing a newsroom or a group or a company to bring in or to diversify more with the talent of journalists, Black and brown journalists? And so I got ideas from them. Also, who could do sensitivity training? So we have people who we know who could do sensitivity training. There's a whole cottage industry of sensitivity training. People who do nothing but that for a living. I know about it because in some of the discrimination class action cases I've had, we've had programmatic initiatives to accompany that, programmatic meaning, putting in place systems where going forward, the organization, the company, in this case, the Daily Report or the corporation, would be committed to doing better, but it takes that commitment. And it takes more. The conversation is very good, but we still have to go further, because otherwise there's going to be another time, another deadline, another issue comes up, and then we're back in the same place. And then it's not really so funny. And then it's not really going to get this reaction. It's going to escalate to where it is now. And that's where now we have the ability, we have the power to work together so that we hear each other and we can come up with solutions so that it can be filtered through the team of people here. And I do applaud you all for being here. This is an uncomfortable discussion. Well, I can tell you it's uncomfortable for me to have this discussion because it's a reminder every day that unconscious bias exists. And that's a painful reminder for me. It's painful if you're Black and you have to have a discussion about unconscious bias yet again in everything that you do. So it's uncomfortable for both of us. This is not a hee hee ha ha kumbaya. That's why it's this uncomfortable discussion. It's what Anita has so, and I have to applaud, again, Don Jones, these courageous discussions. It takes courage on both sides to sit and talk about it because we have to find solutions. And for that, we all have to be honest. We've got to open up and be raw about it and say, look, this was really something that cut to the core of our community. And then you'll have to say, yeah, we missed this. We completely missed it. And when we do that, then we have a foundation upon which to build solutions. And we want to be part of the solution. We don't want to just have it Because it will surface again if there's not some type of modification somewhere. It will surface, mark my word, been in too much litigation that way. And then when it surfaces, then there's a legal issue because there's an issue of notice. That's a very, very different issue. We're not in that zone. We're in the zone of let's sit down and find the solutions. And I think part of it is having an openness of spirit, which we have. And I think what you all have too. And that is what we appreciate. Because
Sarah, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, that's it.
No, I wanted to see if Sarah had that letter because you talked about the very thoughtful approach in the letter that had a list of areas and things that you wanted to see accomplished. And as I was getting ready, I came across that letter and I was going to see if Shara could put it up on the share her screen, put it up. Perhaps not.
Yeah,
You
I
can.
can. Give me just a minute.
Okay,
Just a minute.
well, Jenna, while she's pulling that up, why don't you guys go ahead and talk about what it was like for you in the meeting, that meeting from your perspective. How did it go? How did it feel? How did you receive information? And what did you, when you walked into that room, what did you want to see accomplished? And when you left, were you any different? Do you believe that your organization was any different or any better as a result of that conversation? So go for it.
We were on the road to feeling different because we knew that we had already talked about some issues that we had wanted to change. For example, we wanted to add, coincidentally, the term editorial board, and that we're working on right now is to create a board of members of the legal community around Atlanta and Georgia, and a diverse one at that, for two reasons. One, to serve as a sounding board for us for when there are issues that either we have questions about or things that they can tell us about that they think are important that we should know, possibly if we're missing something or overdoing something. And secondly, to write editorials that they can express their issues on anything they want, including our own coverage. So that was something that I thought was what that we were thinking about, and it came out of that meeting that we were going to do that. Hank, you want to say something?
Yeah, from my perspective, I was so grateful for the meeting because I would have understood if people were just upset and wanted to, vent and leave it at that. I welcome the meeting. I've been, like I said, I've been with the company a long time, and I've had, not necessarily because of an issue, I've never had an issue like this pop up, but I've had discussions. I came up mainly through Philadelphia and working with folks in the Black legal community, and we would have very honest debate and discussions about some of these issues. And, Jonathan, referenced it. One of the big wake up calls for me was I went to a friend's law school graduation, and at the end of the night, his father, who was an old-time criminal defense attorney, just looked at me, and then the name of the paper in Philadelphia is the Legal Intelligencer. And he just looked at me and he said, how come the only time a Black man's on the cover is when he's in trouble? And in all honesty, I wouldn't say necessarily that's right, but it didn't matter. That's his perception. I got to deal with that. And it was a wake up call. And that led to a fundamental sort of change of spirit and sort of realizing it's not enough to just sort of sit back. You've got to kind of engage. You got to talk about these issues. You've got to make sure you've got diverse voices. You've got people on your editorial board. You got to make sure you're engaging on these issues on a consistent basis. So for this meeting, I went into it very hopeful. I tend to be an optimist. I went into it really just to listen. What struck me again was how deep the hurt was. And it really, I don't want to hurt anybody. And I don't think anybody on our staff wants to hurt anybody. And that resonated with me. And my other thought is, I always want myself and all of us to do better. And, I referenced that, I think, in the apology. And so from my vantage point, I was grateful. It struck me how, and it stayed with me, how deep the hurt was. And it reinforced how we have to keep working on these issues, and be open and listen and responsive and try to correct these things.
Yeah, I would just add that, receiving the letters was uncomfortable, but the meeting itself, I appreciated having the meeting because it was constructive, and I think we all did learn a lot from that meeting. So I like Hank said, I welcome the meeting. I was actually really appreciative of everyone's time, and for everyone taking the time, not just to tell us that they were angry and upset, but also to talk about next steps and sort of how we can get something constructive out of this situation.
And CK, and for all of you, I have on the screen that letter that really summarizes some of the issues that CK, that you and the other bar leaders that you mentioned talked about or went into that meeting with, so that there was some kind of focus in the first one. And I must say that was me. Selfishly, I wanted to make sure that we had this courageous conversation, because again, part of Don's vision for this group and how we can address this issue is to come to the table and talk about issues that are uncomfortable. And I said, what better way to start those conversations? Because by the time the meeting occurred, there were all types of mea culpas and overtures that were being made that struck me and others. So yeah, that was me, number one. I wanted to make sure we got that done. But CK, why don't you talk about the other areas here and items and why those things were important?
Absolutely. I want to mention the tremendous input of Gary Spencer as well. He was very, very helpful in all of this dialogue. Secondly, implementing implicit bias training for all ALM staff on an ongoing basis. That's what I talked about. There are organizations that put together, they study the organization or the company, they have a lot of interviews, and then they put together a training program that is tailored to that company. And it's based on the information that they get. It's fairly common in corporate America now, because this issue is an issue that's been going on for a long time. And there have been many steps, I call them programmatic initiatives, that have been put in place to address this. So that the training is critical, because sometimes you just don't even know what you don't know. You don't realize that there might be implicit bias. And pulling, it's like taking an onion and peeling back the layers of that onion. And when you peel it back, then you get to the heart and the core of the issue. And there are organizations and groups that are designed to peel back that onion and come up with a plan that's best suited for the company. So we felt, and it can't just be for some staff, it's got to be for everybody. Right. Because it's up and down, it's sideways. However the corporate structure is, it's got to be across the board. Because if you have on a lower level or mid-level management that have the training, but not senior management, then it's defeated the purpose. Because at the end of the day, senior management might have to sign off on something. If they're not in, if they don't buy in, then it's not going to happen. And then you have a vicious circle. The same unconscious bias, implicit bias will continue over and over. And it's like inertia. It's like doing the same, and insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, but you get the same result if you don't have it at all levels. 3, hiring diverse staff by partnering with the National Association of Black Journalists and creating a work environment that fosters retention. So one of the points that I made and that we all made as a group was, there are extraordinarily talented Black journalists out here that probably would be very, very interested in working with this, wonderful company. I mean, we're not saying that everybody's bad. We're saying there's bias that has led us to this point. So a way of addressing that is having a more diverse workforce. But it's not enough to just hire. And we had a discussion about this, because I remember you all said, well, in the past we have. I'm like, well, how many people are still working there? What is the retention? Because it's the retention that will inform you of the workplace. If people are leaving in droves, it's the same thing in law firms, It's a question of how are people how do they feel and do they want to stay there? There's natural attrition, but when you see Black journalists coming in and leaving on a regular basis, that speaks to something different. And again, there are groups that look at this, that monitor this, and put in place programs to help. 4, supporting programs that are aligned with the mission of GABWA, Gate City Bar Association, the National Bar Association, to build a pipeline of successful Black lawyers and judges to include scholarships for Black law students and internships offered by HBCU students. Why is that important? It's important because we're talking about building a stronger and better America. We are, and it's not just in everything that we do, we're trying to just do the best. Our country is in some kind of crisis right now on a social justice level. Black Lives Matter. We see people of all races marching side by side peacefully, because they want change. And they're holding people's feet to the fire for that change. So supporting programs, that's part of change. The mission of these organizations, because you don't really need to go far if you want to know what that change could look like, because we are offering ourselves to you in partnership with you so that we can begin that process of how you all can come to this evolution and be more progressive on some of these issues. And so that, number 4, is the progressive nature of bringing about change. HBCU students, Black lawyers, the pipeline, we have successful Black lawyers and judges in this market. And you want to build, what I do, I will say, and what I liked about you all did immediately, there was an article about a discrimination case involving a professor at Emory. And the very next day or 2 days later, I got a call saying, CK, can you, or do you know someone who would be able to contribute to this article? I couldn't, because I had represented people, quite frankly, at Emory, and there would be potentially a conflict. And so I did recommend someone, and that person did weigh in. That's the type of partnership that we're talking about, that now think of when there are issues involving discrimination or actually involving corporate issues. We're everywhere. We're at the top of our game everywhere. It's just a different perspective when you have a more diverse pool of people that you're asking input from. So that's an example of how aligning and calling on us, and it makes a difference, we believe, in the reporting, certainly, and it helps everybody. 5, creating diverse national and local editorial boards and/or advisory committees to include permanent seats designated for Gabois, Gate City, and NBA appointments. So oftentimes what we've seen whenever these type of issues arise, let's say in other corporations, let's leave you all aside, is that there's really a lot of enthusiasm initially, and people want to form editorial boards and do all of these things, and then it dies out over time a year later. That's not what we're talking about, because again, the same thing will happen again a year later, 2 years later, and then all this is for naught. So creating these boards, and if you all, and we talked about the editorial boards, advisory committees, these things are important because they go straight to, how are we doing with our policies and procedures? How is the training going? How can we help? What's working, what's not working? That's what these because again, we want to create, you all want a much stronger organization and business so that so we minimize the likelihood of things like this happening. We want that too, because we don't want to be in these uncomfortable positions of having to have these kinds of courageous discussions, right? So the courageous discussions do further what we're doing, but it would be better, of course, if we didn't have to have these sort of uncomfortable exchanges and these hurt feelings. So the editorial boards, the advisory committees, the permanent seats, not short term, we'll just do it 1 day, 1 month, 1 year, but long term, that's where you have a systemic change, where then you have a chance of eliminating and minimizing the implicit bias. And then you've got great journalism, great journalism. I've seen it happen. It can happen, but these are the steps that we believe need to happen.
Well, thank you for that, CK. And gentlemen, I just got a message from Sarah letting me know that John, his internet connection dropped for real. Oh, did you get,
I'm back.
John,
I'm back.
he wanted to make sure you guys knew he was not feeling some kind of way, that he did not do that on purpose. Gentlemen, I think people are probably interested in knowing whether the company decided to implement any of those ideas that CK enumerated. Well, we know we've gotten number 1 checked off, but what about the others? I think folks would like to know, would be curious about what the response was to those.
Oh, very open. And we're going to be following through on most of those. And when I say most of them, I mean basically all of them, with some degrees of slight differences. But for instance, I asked, my boss is Molly Miller. She's the chief content officer. And, I passed along the letter, the follow-up letter. And she was already working on some of these issues even before this happened. So I asked her for an update, and the company has engaged, I don't know the name of the company, they've engaged with a consulting group to come up with a long-term diversity inclusion program, including sensitivity training. Molly on her own is also talking to individuals about bringing in addition to additional training, diversity training for the editorial staff. She's creating an internal diversity committee to sort of examine these issues. In terms of the editorial boards, we're going to put together the editorial boards. We will make sure they are diverse. I don't know if Sarah, can you put the letter back up just so I can see all the points? So I want to make sure
Supporting, we talked about scholarships, supporting HBCUs, journalists, partnering and reaching out to NABJ, things of that nature as well.
Molly's doing that too. And that's real quick. I want to touch on the diversity in the newsroom. And I think I said this in our meeting. Our track record of hiring and also promoting and retaining people once they get in the door in terms of a resume is pretty strong. Where we're lacking is we have to get more. We've got to do a better job of doing outreach to get the resumes in the door at the front end. But the one thing I'd like to just point out, and I was just sort of doing the math a little bit in terms of stuff. So we have in our legal newsroom, we've got 6 theme desks. So these are based around things like business of law, litigation, regulatory, in-house, culture, and there's one other one I think I'm forgetting. We have 6 desks. As of now, when I took over in 2017, I've been with the company a long time, but I only took over the theme desk in 2017. When I took over, there wasn't a single diverse person running any of these desks. Now 3 of the 6 are run by people of color. And I think that is going to be something that's going to pay off long-term, because when you have people in decision-making positions who can actually hire, it's not enough. I don't want us just hiring people. And to your point, CK, like we see in law firms all the time, right? The big corporate firms, they'll bring in people and they get churned out. Right. To me, I want people in leadership positions where they're actually in a position now to hire and help infuse the culture, not just at the ground level, but at the upper level.
Hank, can I ask on that? How many of those people of color are African American? Just out of curiosity.
Two of the 3.
2 of the 3. Okay.
2 of the 3. And of the 3, the other thing we do promote, we're big on promoting from within, and 2 of the 3 are people who are promoted from within.
Got it.
And the other one was, and I think we talked about this, and this is something, and I don't want to go on too much at length, but it was interesting. The other person was someone we hired from the outside. And at the time we had someone in the hiring office who would help go out and do recruitment in general. And she came to me and she said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, I need someone on the West Coast. I want someone who's diverse, ideally someone who's also diverse and a woman who's got this background, this kind of background in terms of coverage. Go get me somebody. And she did. And it worked out. And I think we need more of that, an intent from the outset of what you're looking for.
Right. Well, I think, and I can tell you, NABJ, I've worked with NABJ, and again, like I said, I represented a couple of presidents. Whatever classification and qualification and geographical location that you need, they got. Huge organization, massive, and I would say virtually, probably 98% of Black journalists in the world belong to NABJ. So there are a lot. It's just a question of looking and having those opportunities and being open to it. And so we do appreciate that you are open to it. I mean, and open to recruiting in that way, because you do have to be deliberate and intentional. You all report on law firms, when I say you all nationally, on Cravath. When I was in law school, Cravath didn't have any Black partners. How is it 35 years later? It's the same thing. There's some things that are just really remarkable and unbelievable, but we feel with your organization and with the power of the media that we are encouraged that you all are taking these steps, because we want to be part of it every step of the way and helping. And so I'm happy to hear that of those things that we have suggested that you all are on your way. We would like to know, and we would like to know a little bit more about the, whether scholarships, inclusion, with on the editorial boards of people, from Gabba, Gate City, and
Right.
MBA, because we are the ones that are carrying the weight on this. Of
Right.
course, we all total represent over 66,000 Black lawyers. That is 66,000. That is not insignificant.
Right.
Gabba and Gate City are affiliate chapters of the National Bar Association, just incidentally. So, the issue that I brought, this was an issue that the National Bar throughout the country took up. So even though it happened in Atlanta, Georgia, the National Bar, this was an issue that we all agreed on a national basis, we need a position we needed to take. I just wanted to let you know the scope of it. And so that really actually is a good thing, because when there are solutions, the good things, the information gets disseminated as well.
Right.
And there would be nothing better that we'd like to disseminate than the solutions and the wonderful steps that you all take in addressing some of these issues. I mean, people talk about bad stuff, but we need to talk about good stuff too, when there are solutions implemented in place as a result of this type of exchange. So I just wanted to make sure that that we know, and that we're sensitive to that as well.
Absolutely. And one other quick thing that you mentioned this, CK, and this is something I talked about with Jonathan and Zach in advance. I think another thing in terms of improving things in general is also, and because we were talking about this internally in our organization about diversity of sources, and how important that is. And we were talking about that before this ever blew up. But I'd like to view this as an opportunity to really try to find sources both locally and nationally on a number of topics. Because I think the more that you increase your outreach to different people and different perspectives, I'm not putting aside the training, but I think that's almost as equally important, is having constant conversations with people with different perspectives. And to your point though, too, about, I've said before, we shouldn't be just holding up a mirror to the status quo, and saying it's okay. And, I know I've seen it over the years. You talk to people enough times, it will help elevate them and promote them. And it's not that necessarily that's our job, but it's important to do. And it's also important to get those voices in there. So that's something I'd like us to work with you guys.
I can tell you from a national standpoint, that's like when you all called me about that article, there were 7 people that I immediately reached out to. And I'm talking about within 3 minutes. In fact, I had you all on the line. I said, wait, just hold on 1 second, because I had some Zoom call, and we got immediately someone on that. And another thing I just wanted to point out that's really important in terms of diversity and inclusion, evaluation. Like when you evaluate and evaluate people to promote and pay. I mean, I think it's a pet peeve of many. I had this discussion with Avrita Hansen, I just want to say, who's a past president of the Gate City Bar, past president of Gabwa. And it really, when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we also have to remember that once people are in the door, when we talk about promotions and pay, there's a place there as well for that discussion. And I know that, just again, from our discussions, but also because there's litigation surrounding that. For managers, for all managers, again, when you talk about building a more inclusive workplace, you have to look at all of it. The consultant that you have hired, if it's a consultant that does the kind of work that we're really talking about, they will put in place a plan to ensure that happens, because there has to be a complete buy-in.
So listen, the conversation was courageous, because I sense that you guys could go on forever, but I want to thank you on behalf of of our committee, on behalf of our bar president, Don Jones. I just want to thank all of you for participating. I was very intentional, and I wore my Good Trouble t-shirt, but I did not count on my Zoom, the length and all that. But I will tell you, we are prepared. Our committee is prepared. We want to get into some good trouble. So for those of you who tuned in today, if you want to continue to be on the front line of these conversations, we're going to have discussion groups dealing with these types of issues across the state. Please be on the lookout for more. But for now, I thank you to each of our participants, and thank you to 102 people who signed in, registered and tuned in to hear from you guys this afternoon. That's it for now. Bye now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.